What is going on, alpha males? Welcome to Alpha Male Podcast, where we talk about what it means to be a man, made in the image of God, strong, dominant, and in control, making godly men strong and strong men godly. That's the mission statement here. Today is a much requested episode. Long time ago, back when I was the commander of a tactical team, and I've been reluctant to do it. And here's why. There's many, but there's a couple of big reasons why I'm not a law enforcement officer anymore. And I don't really want to get into that. I have shared that more with the patrons on a Patreon only episode. And there's a lot of politics and stuff that goes into that whenever you talk about law enforcement. I don't want to get into politics. But I'll try and do this show since it was requested and be a good servant to you, the audience. Do another episode on lessons learned in law enforcement. Personal lessons that you hopefully can apply to your life that are applicable without getting into all the politics of law enforcement. Now, I guess I should mention, with foregoing the lengthy bio, I have a background in law enforcement. LAPD, worked some of the nastiest streets in the country, worked regular assignment like patrol, worked more specialized assignments, fugitive recovery, warrant enforcement. I also worked with and for some three-letter government agencies I don't want to specify in more specialized roles, just to establish some street cred on the bona fides for me talking about this episode. Lessons learned. Situational awareness. Situational awareness is really important. I know in the tactical community, which if you listen to this, you're probably in, right? If you listen to this, you likely listen to Gunfighter Life, and I like tactical stuff too. You're probably into the cool new knife, the cool new gun. This polymer striker-fired handgun is better than that one, and is this hollow point the best for me right now in my life with my barrel length and this velocity under these parameters? And what about heavy clothing in the winter and all that stuff ad nausea? I get that. I'm a tactical nerd too. But situational awareness is so much more important if you're talking about surviving tactical situations. Situational awareness is important. You could have the fanciest STI 2011, which I like, or now their Staccato with the best duty ammo and the best uber cool million lumen, not literally, but whatever they're up to, 1200 lumen flashlight with your multicam get up, and some meth addict could walk up behind you and put a high point in your liver and drop you like a sack of potatoes. Situational awareness is important. And I'm about having good stuff and good kit. I'm not putting that down, but I'm saying if I'm kicking in a door, doing room clearing, situational awareness is probably a much bigger part in how that tactical scenario goes for me and my men, assuming I'm in charge or even if I'm not, than whether I'm running a Glock versus an M&P. Do I prefer an M&P? Yeah, I do, but the situational awareness is going to be far more important than the other considerations. And that doesn't just have to be kicking in a door. You can extrapolate that into many other scenarios. Now, also, I'm reluctant to give dating advice on this. By God's grace, I am married, and I give God all the glory and the credit for that, to a beautiful, wonderful wife who I'm blessed to be the head of. Beautiful, smart, got her master's degree, beautiful inside and out. I'm a blessed man. You can extrapolate this into dating, right? Situational awareness. If you are courting, and I'm not for casual dating, I'm not for the, whatever they call it, hookup culture, the gross, disgusting things that go on in culture today. I didn't grow up a Christian, and I grew up thinking that those kind of sexual things were going to make me happy in life. By God's grace, when I became a Christian, I was chaste until I married my wife for what seemed to me like a very long time. I'm not condoning casual dating, but when you're courting, which you might call dating, for the purpose of marriage, a woman, situational awareness. What does she like? What is she into? Oh, she mentioned that she really likes orchids. She'll probably be aware of that. You just met her, and without you bringing it up, especially not on the first date, the topic of, preparedness comes up. How does she respond to that? What does she think about that? Take note of that. She really likes raw carrots but doesn't like them cooked. She really likes cooked onions but doesn't like them raw. Right? You should probably take a note of that. If you get a second date, you decide that's worth pursuing for marriage. Recalling those things and recounting them back to her might show her that you're a little bit more interested and a little bit more stand apart than the average dude, right? This is not the average dude podcast. This is the alpha male podcast. Situational awareness. Now, I don't generally eat pizza. I'm not a big fan of carbs, but let's just use this as an example because most people eat pizza. The next second date, you go out for pizza. You're looking at the menu and you say, right away we can write this one off because it has raw onions, and I remember that you don't like raw onions. Boom. She's probably going to appreciate that. Situational awareness. You can apply this to something completely different. How about hunting? As an example, it just rained and you went out and did some tracking, and you noticed there was some big buck sign in that area recently because it had just rained and washed away all the other tracks. You noticed they came from this area that you deduced would be a very good bedding area down to this water source. Next time you get the opportunity to spot and stalk or still hunt, you plan that in so you can approach what you would deduce would be a good bottleneck to ambush said big buck, thus making it, by God's grace and his provision hopefully, making you a more successful hunter. Brief side note, if you want to call this a tactical tip in the middle, if you're talking about deer prints, this is not a hard and fast rule, but in general, a doe will often step into her prints, meaning like her front legs and hind legs will often be in line. A big buck, his front hooves, his cloven hooves will be wider than his rear legs. He often will not step into his own tracks. Also, likewise, a big-bodied buck, especially a big mature buck, often his front hooves will be spread apart and pretty wide. Also, if you're a good enough tracker to know where a deer stand and urinated, a doe will often urinate directly down on her hind legs, and a buck will often urinate forward for obvious anatomical reasons. So there you go. You get good advice on buck urination and dating in this episode. Make sure you give this podcast a good review and you're subscribed. Let's continue on. I think that's enough examples of situational awareness. Here's another thing, and I suppose I learned this earlier when I came from the military, but if you didn't have the military background, probably you would encounter this in law enforcement. Tunnel vision and auditory exclusion are a real thing, and I guess it got reinforced in law enforcement, especially in the era of video footage, because you'd be surprised at the things that you don't honestly remember when you're jacked up on adrenaline, a life or death situation, and you see a video and you're like, wow, I don't even remember that. Like, as an example, theoretically, if you had some dude down on the ground wailing on him because he just tried to square up with you, and you had somebody else kicking you in the back or hitting you in the back of the head, you might not even realize that because you're focused on the threat that you're grappling with at the time. Somebody may be shouting at you for whatever reason, and obviously it's at the audible level where you can hear it, like you physically can hear it, but you pay no attention to it. You have no recollection or memory of it. And that kind of makes sense, right? From a fighting standpoint, you focus on the known threat. If you have somebody actively trying to kill you, you're going to focus on that. And it takes training and experience to pull back from that once that threat is subdued and scan the area and make sure there's no other threats. It kind of plays into situational awareness, where you can be so hyper-focused on one situation at the detriment of other simultaneous threats. But that's a lesson you learn. Auditory exclusion, tunnel vision, slow motion timing is a real thing. you've ever been in a fight, it doesn't even have to be a fight. I guess it could be any really adrenaline, testosterone jacked up kind of scenario where it seems like things are in slow motion, but they're not. But to you, they are. That's a real thing. And you can leverage those things to your advantage if you are blessed with the ability, training, and experience to do so. They absolutely are real. Here is another one. Violence is real. And that may not come as a shock to you. Of course you know violence is real. But I mean, really let that sink in that it's a part of life for a big chunk of the population. Now, I may have a unique experience with this. I grew up pretty poor in the rural South. And from studying cultures and studying this, apparently the South kind of has a reputation for that. The poor rural South has a reputation for just throwing down and fighting. And I fought a lot as a kid. I fought a lot in school. Again, I grew up a heathen, a pagan. And I'm not even going to pretend that all the fights and all the times I fought were morally justifiable. But I was no stranger to violence. And then I joined the Marine Corps. Not just the Marine Corps, but the Marine Corps Infantry, which likewise has a culture of violence. When I joined the LAPD, this was after my combat tours, and I kind of gained a reputation in LAPD and other law enforcement roles for not being afraid to use force, let's put it politely. And I'm going to be real with you there too. Not all of those situations where I used force was that the wisest thing to do. Just because something is given the hominis dominus approved by department policy or the law doesn't mean it's the best course of action, right? And hopefully in life I grow closer to God and continue to grow closer to God. And I have a better understanding of that now than I did then. Just because I can, under color of authority, because I have a tin star on my chest, use force, doesn't mean it's always good to use force. I shouldn't be looking for an excuse because it's justified, I just cold cock somebody, right? That's not the right attitude. And hopefully I've matured in my older days. That said, there absolutely is a moral and biblically justifiable time to use force. And if you're somebody, as I've realized in my later life talking to people who don't have my similar background, not everybody is acquainted with violence. Not everybody thinks like that. Not everybody is acquainted with the use of force. But here's what you, man, need to understand. There is a significant portion of the population that is. Where violence is a means to an end. It is a tool to be leveraged to get what they want. And just like I shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that everybody thinks like me and behaves like me, you shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that everybody thinks and behaves like you. And just because you may be reluctant to use violence doesn't mean that they are. And just because you have a hang-up on using force doesn't mean that they do. I'll give you an example that unique to me. Like, I grew up fighting, I said that, but I have a moral hang-up on striking a woman, right? That's not something I'm comfortable with. And I assumed that applied to a lot of cultures. That absolutely does not apply to other cultures. I would submit, do some study of cultures, and there are some cultures where they'll hit a woman before they'll hit a man. It's just part of the culture. They just hit women. Here's the thing I want you to take away from that is that just because you don't see violence as a solution in a situation doesn't mean that everybody else thinks like you. If you're dealing with somebody and you wouldn't use violence, don't assume that that person doesn't deem it acceptable to use violence. Violence is absolutely a real thing and is used quite often for certain sections of the population. You should let that sink in and be aware of that and put that in your, let's say, life planning. And this plays nicely into the next point. Get outside your box. Get outside your box. Oftentimes today, especially with social media and people that have TV and watch news, you kind of live in an echo chamber. And again, you can think that most people think like you or should think like you or behave like you. But the fact is they probably don't. And I don't want to be, one of the reasons I don't talk a lot about law enforcement, military stuff specifically is I don't want to be that guy that's like, one time at band camp, one time LAPD when I was in a high-speed chase, right? I don't want this podcast to turn into stories about me telling you how cool the stuff I did was. I try and stay away from those stories on purpose. Even with close friends and family, I rarely discuss those things. But I'm going to tell you a story that illustrates this point of getting outside your box. I don't remember the exact quote, so these won't be exact quotes. This is a long time ago, but I was early in my LAPD career. And I was assigned to a division that was, to say largely Hispanic would be an understatement, almost entirely Hispanic. In fact, the vast majority of our graduating class of police officers in LAPD was Hispanic. Out of 54 in our class, I can recall, I think, 4 white males in the class. And I think 2 black males. A big reason for that is you have to have a pretty good use of Spanish to actually graduate. In fact, that was one of my hardest things in the LAPD Police Academy. It wasn't being able to write an essay, because a lot of what you do as a cop as an administrator, you write a lot. You use a pen a lot more than you use a gun or a fist or a baton. Just get that reality if you're thinking about becoming a cop. It wasn't that. It wasn't the PT for sure. It was the Spanish. But anyway, I am blonde hair, blue-eyed. I am white among whites. I don't apologize for that. That's how God made me. In fact, my nickname when I was LAPD, they sometimes called me Steve McQueen. I assume blonde hair and blue eyes and maybe some other reasons, if you know who Steve McQueen is. But I wasn't going to argue with that nickname, right? You could have a lot worse nicknames. But blonde hair and blue eyed. And I go to this division. At the time, there were 19 divisions. I think there are more now. But I went to a heavy Hispanic division. And part of this was community outreach, right? Not everything is a baton. Not everything is a gunfight. We went to do community outreach. And I went to a school, and I think it was middle school-ish. And I had a young, and not that young. I mean, she wasn't like 3 or 4 or 5. I want to say middle school age. I can't remember the exact age. But she came up to me and looked at me and said, "You have blonde hair and blue eyes." To which I replied, yes, I do. She was kind of taken back by that. And she said something to the effect of, "I've never seen anybody with blonde hair and blue eyes." Keep in mind, this is not Outer Mongolia. This is not the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This is Los Angeles. If I take her statement to be true, she had never seen anybody, I assume outside of TV. She had never seen anybody with blonde hair and blue eyes. That was a reality check for me, right? And that plays into this lesson. Get outside your box. Not everybody thinks like you. Not everybody votes like you. Not everybody thinks the same way that you think. Not everybody agrees with the same things you agree with. And this doesn't have to be a cop thing. I love my wife. She's from a far different background than me. She's from a nice nuclear family. I am not. Raised by a single teenage mother. I would call fairly middle of the road, middle class, as I would consider, looking back on it, very poor. Not like I didn't have food to eat, but pretty poor. Like no air conditioning growing up in the South, walking down to the nearest town to use a payphone because we didn't have one, kind of poor. Different backgrounds. Also, her family, a lot of them from Detroit in the auto industry, heavily Democrat, highly unionized Democrat kind of family. And when I'm around them, because I love my wife, right, they think far differently than me. Things that I think like, oh yeah, everybody should understand that shall not be infringed means shall not be infringed. It's about as clear and concise as you can get. But they don't think that way. And it's a mistake for you to think that everybody thinks the way that you do. And a big chunk of that I learned law enforcement because I was exposed to a lot of different cultures. Although LA is one big city, there's a big difference between Southeast or Rampart Division and Chinatown or Pacific Division or West LA or Northeast Division, right? I mean, probably as different culturally as Italy is from England, or South Africa is from Australia. We think because it's all one country or even one city that people think the same and know the same things and have a similar background, but they don't. There's probably a giant chunk of this country right now that thinks radically different on many different things than you do. And if you have a firm foundation, if you have the proper compass of right and wrong that doesn't change, right? Truth doesn't change based on cultural boundaries. If it changed, then it wouldn't be the truth. Truth is not transient. Truth doesn't change. Whether you're black, white, Hispanic, green, right and wrong is right and wrong. Truth is truth. And you get that by knowing and understanding God and God's Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. If you have that strong moral compass, and you know, no, this is wrong. This is malum in se. This is evil by nature. You cannot do that morally justifiably, no matter what. You shall not steal, right? It's one of the 10 commandments. You shall not steal. That's pretty black and white. The only place that is mentioned, you shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another, right? If a culture says that's okay, then that part of the culture is garbage. And I'm not afraid to say that. The first of all the commandments, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the first of the 10 commandments, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. There's only one God. And if your culture says otherwise, then that's garbage. It's wrong. There's only one God. If you have some polytheistic religion, I don't care how much you love the culture, that's wrong. It's false. Our God is a jealous God. You shall have no other gods before him. There is only one God. Polytheism is garbage. I don't care what culture it's in. And I don't apologize for saying that. And you shouldn't be apologizing for standing up and being firm in that belief. Right? But some things in culture are not malum in se. They're not evil by nature. They're just different culture. Part of the thing that I liked about all the travel that God's blessed me to do in life, I get exposed to different kinds of food. I really like Mediterranean curry. My wife really likes Thai food. Right? As long as it wasn't sacrificed to an idol, as long as it's something God considers food, I'm not eating blood, without any underlying moral stuff. I want to combine that culture and go out and shoot an elk and make delicious peanut butter curry. That's great. And I wouldn't know that and be exposed to curry if I had only ever grown up on what you would call basic American food. Hamburgers and french fries, right? But get outside of your box as long as you have a strong moral compass. Now, don't be going to a strip club and say, I want to experience a different part of culture, right? You know what sin is. Don't use this as an excuse to sin. But it's okay to get outside your box. Talk to and hang out with a group that maybe is far different of you than you. That could be as easy in a lot of places as talking to somebody on the different side of the political aisle. Now, some things, just like in other cultures, consider that a culture. Some things are just wrong. They're evil by nature. Abortion. It's wrong. It is absolutely evil and murder to rip a baby out of the womb and kill it. Period. There's no room for debate on that. And you should never wiggle on that stance. But you can still interact with people and understand how they think. And maybe it won't come as such a shock to you. You may not agree with it, but it may not come as such a shock to you when so-and-so gets elected. And you think, how could anybody vote like that? And then you actually get out and talk to those kind of people and you're like, oh yeah. They have had this job for 20 years. They're in a union and the union tells them to vote this way and they really don't think about it outside of that. That's how. That's a big reason why. Things like that. Get outside your box. But I would say get outside your box. See what and how other people think. If you look at the Apostle Paul, he was familiar with other cultures. He used it to evangelize to them. You can do the same thing. Again, as long as you have a good, strong, moral, biblical basis for right and wrong in your life, and things that are acceptable and things that are not. For instance, I would have no problem going to a Renaissance festival, and I don't do this, but I would have no moral problem with going to a Renaissance festival and getting dressed up if somebody invited me to do that. I used to do the Mountain Man rendezvous where you get up dressed up like the old mountain men, and I did it mostly for the shooting competitions. Black powder competitions and hatchet throwing, knife throwing competitions. I really like that, and I would get dressed up. I don't see any moral problem with that. But there is a giant problem with if you wanted to go to a drag queen show and dress up. That is clearly against the law of God. A woman shall not wear anything that pertains to a man, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment. For all who do so are an abomination to the Lord your God. Right? If you have a good, strong biblical basis, you'll know the difference. But it's okay to get outside your box. If you only ever listen to Fox News, maybe try another channel. Maybe even try Russia Today, right? What are they thinking? What does their culture think? And you might be thinking, that's propaganda. You honestly don't think anything that you hear on Fox News is propaganda? It's not gospel. There's propaganda there too. I guess I had more to say on this topic than I surmised at the beginning. We're already getting close to, probably by the time we wrapped up, 30-ish minutes. So I'm probably going to cut this off and do another section of lessons learned in law enforcement. If you enjoyed this episode, hope you'll consider liking, subscribing, becoming a patron. Supporting the show to help make godly men strong and strong men godly. Situational awareness exercise is going to be your tactical tip of the day. I would do this when I was on that tactical team. Do this to keep my situational awareness sharp. If you're working a 12-hour grave shift, let's be honest, you're not always the sharpest tool in the shed at 3 a.m. A little thing you can do next time you're out in public. Pick a really obscure color, like chartreuse or teal, right? It can't be something so generic like blue, but like teal or burnt sienna, right? Pick a robin's egg blue, some kind of hue or shade of a color that's pretty specific that you're not going to see all the time, and then go on the hunt to find that color. It'll switch you from that passive mode of just being in your environment to hunting in your environment. It's a good situational awareness exercise. If you want to add on to that, once you find that, the second you spot it, whatever distance it is, try and estimate that distance. How far away is that? That more applies if you're into tactics and shooting and hunting and things like that, but a good exercise that you can do for situational awareness. That's your tactical, practical tip of the day. Your tactical verse of the day. The tactical verse of the day, by God's grace. Be sober-minded. Be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, firm in your faith. Comments. Be sober. Be watchful. Are you addicted? Are you addicted to propaganda? Are you addicted to a certain thing? Are you so entrenched in a certain part of culture that if you knew that God was telling you it was wrong, you still would cling to it because you identify more with that culture than being a child of God? Just like violence is a real physical thing in our world, you are also in a real spiritual battle. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion. Remember that. Be on guard for that. Be sober-minded and be watchful. Watching and waiting for the coming of your Lord, Jesus Christ. Live like that. Live a life like that. Walk that narrow, difficult way, growing closer to God daily. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.